The most painful secret of Big Pun is a documented history of severe PTSD and catastrophic biological collapse. Using extreme binge eating to cope with childhood abuse, the 28-year-old rapper rapidly expanded to over 700 pounds, severely compressing his internal organs and triggering domestic volatility. In 2000, he suffered a massive heart attack in a hotel room. When paramedics attempted emergency resuscitation, his immense body mass severely hindered their efforts to reach his failing heart. He died instantly, his heart crushed under his own body weight. This is the cold physical reality of untreated trauma. Before he became one of the most technically gifted rappers in history, Christopher Lee Rios was a boy thrown into a war he never asked to fight. Born on November 10, 1971, in the South Bronx, Pun grew up in a neighborhood that felt more like a battlefield than a home. The streets were loud with sirens, gunfire, and the constant hum of desperation. Buildings stood half abandoned, windows boarded up, and the smell of decay lingered in the air. This was the Bronx of the late 1970s and early 1980s, a place where survival came before dreams. His stepfather had returned from Vietnam carrying more than just memories. The man suffered from severe post-traumatic stress, and he brought the war home with him. Pun, still a small child, became the target. The beatings often came without warning, sometimes in the middle of the night. Pun later recalled being woken at 3 a.m. and forced to do push-ups until his arms gave out. Bypassing the mere physical pain, the true lasting devastation targeted his central nervous system. From a very young age, his body learned to stay on high alert. Every shadow, every raised voice, every sudden movement triggered the same response: fight or flight. For Pun, there was rarely a safe place to land. By the time he reached his early teens, the constant state of vigilance had become part of who he was. He saw threats everywhere. The Bronx itself became a maze in his mind, every corner hiding potential danger. He learned to read people quickly, to sense tension in a room before anyone spoke. This hyper-awareness would later fuel his extraordinary ability to craft complex, layered rhymes that seemed to anticipate every possible angle of attack. But at the time, it was simply a survival mechanism. When Pun was 15, his mother kicked him out of the house. He had nowhere to go. For months, he slept under bridges, in abandoned buildings, and sometimes on the floor of subway stations. The cold nights in New York winters were brutal. He scavenged for food and avoided trouble as best he could. Those years of homelessness carved something deep into him. He felt invisible to the world, yet constantly watched. The combination of being unseen and yet never truly safe created a strange tension inside him that never fully left. Even then, Pun showed signs of the rage that would later define parts of his life. He punched holes in walls. He chewed on plaster and gravel to stop himself from exploding. Doctors who examined him later noted signs of oppositional defiant disorder and a growing difficulty with empathy. The years of abuse had rewired his brain. He struggled to trust, struggled to feel safe, and struggled to believe that anyone truly cared about him. Yet beneath all of that pain, there was something else growing. Pun had begun to discover language. Words became his first real weapon. He started writing rhymes in notebooks he carried everywhere. At first, it was just a way to get the anger out. But something shifted. He realized he could take the chaos in his head and turn it into something structured, something powerful, something no one could take away from him. The more complicated the rhyme scheme, the more control he felt. Multi-syllabic patterns, internal rhymes, double and triple entendres. These were not just artistic choices. They were the architecture of a mind trying to build walls around itself. By the time he was 18, a municipal lawsuit stemming from a childhood playground injury brought an unexpected windfall. Pun received a settlement of nearly $500,000. For a boy who had slept on the streets, it was life-changing money. But instead of using it to build stability, he used it to feed a new addiction. Food became his escape. The same way some people turn to drugs or alcohol, Pun turned to eating. He ate to fill the emptiness. He ate to quiet the noise in his head. He ate because, for the first time in his life, he could. Within a short period, his weight began slimming rapidly. The boy who had once been forced to do endless push-ups was now building a body that would eventually become its own prison. Those early years in the Bronx did more than damage Pun. They shaped the way he would later move through the world of hip-hop. The technical complexity of his rhymes, the non-stop flow that left no room for breath, the constant sense of something lurking just out of sight, all of it grew from the same root. He had learned early that the world was dangerous. He had learned that the only person he could truly rely on was himself. And he had learned that language, when shaped with enough precision, could become both shield and sword. As Pun moved into his early 20s, the streets of the Bronx still called to him, but something new was pulling him forward. He began performing at local spots, battling other MCs, sharpening his skills in the same way a soldier sharpens a blade. The same hypervigilance that once helped him survive the night now helped him read a crowd, sense when a battle was turning, and strike with devastating accuracy. People started to notice. There was something different about the way he rapped. It was not just fast, it was dense, layered, almost claustrophobic in its complexity. Moving far beyond mere speed, his delivery was overwhelmingly dense, layered, and almost claustrophobic in its complexity. Every line seemed to contain multiple meanings, as if he was trying to say everything at once before the danger could catch up. Yet even as his reputation grew, the old wounds remained. The traumatized child from the South Bronx still lived inside the man. The fear, the rage, the deep distrust, they were all still there, waiting. Pun had found a way to turn his pain into art, but he had not yet found a way to heal the source of that pain. And as his world began to expand beyond the Bronx, the weight of everything he carried would only grow heavier. The streets had taught him how to fight. Now hip-hop would teach him how to turn that fight into something the world could hear. But the cost of carrying so much for so long was already beginning to show. The body that had once been forced to endure endless punishment was now being asked to carry a different kind of burden. And Pun, still young, still angry, still searching for control, had no idea how heavy that burden would eventually become. He kept writing, he kept battling, he kept eating. And with every passing month, the boy from the South Bronx moved closer to becoming the man the world would one day call Big Pun. The rhymes grew more intricate. The flow became more relentless. The hunger, both literal and figurative, grew stronger. He was building something extraordinary, but he was also building something that would one day threaten to destroy him from the inside out. The Bronx had given him scars. It had given him rage. It had given him a mind that never stopped scanning for threats. But it had also given him the raw material for greatness. Pun took that material and began shaping it into something no one had heard before. The result would be brilliant. It would also be tragic. And the roots of both the brilliance and the tragedy were planted in those early years, in the beatings, the homelessness, the endless nights of hypervigilance, and the desperate need to turn chaos into order through the only tool he truly trusted: words. The money changed everything, but not in the way most people would expect. When Christopher Rios received nearly $500,000 from the lawsuit settlement at 18, the world suddenly opened up in ways he had never experienced. For someone who had spent his early teenage years surviving on the streets, the sudden wealth felt almost unreal. Yet instead of using it to build a stable foundation or escape the patterns that had shaped him, Pun turned the money into fuel for a different kind of hunger. Food became his new battlefield, and he approached it with the same intensity he would later bring to his rhymes. He began eating with a kind of desperate purpose. Far exceeding a simple pursuit of taste or pleasure, this consumption served strictly to fill a deeply ingrained psychological void. The same emptiness that had once driven him to punch walls and chew on plaster now drove him toward plates piled high with fried chicken, ribs, pizza, and anything else that could be delivered or bought in bulk. He ate late into the night, sometimes until his stomach ached and he could barely move. The physical fullness provided a temporary silence to the noise in his head. For a few hours, the constant scanning for threats, the memories of beatings at 3 a.m, and the deep sense of distrust quieted down. Food became both comfort and escape, a way to punish and soothe himself at the same time. Within months, his body began to change dramatically. The lean frame that had survived the streets started to expand. What began as noticeable weight gain quickly accelerated. By his early 20s, Pun had crossed 300 pounds. He kept going. The more successful he became in the underground rap scene, the more he ate. It was as if every new battle he won, every new person who praised his skills, triggered another round of eating. Success brought attention, and attention made him feel exposed. Food was the only thing that could pull him back into a place where he felt hidden and safe, even as his body grew larger and less mobile with each passing month. At the same time, something extraordinary was happening with his music. Pun had always used words as armor, but now he was refining that armor into something far more sophisticated. He began developing rhyme schemes that were almost mathematical in their complexity. While other rappers focused on simple end rhymes or basic multis, Pun was constructing entire verses where every single syllable seemed to lock into place with the ones around it. He would stack 4, 5, sometimes 6 syllables in a single line, creating patterns that felt both chaotic and perfectly controlled. It was as if he was building a fortress out of language, a structure so dense and intricate that no one could easily break through. His flow became relentless. There were almost no pauses for breath. He would deliver line after line in a continuous stream, as though stopping would allow something dangerous to catch up with him. Listeners who heard him for the first time often found themselves leaning forward, trying to catch every word. The effect was hypnotic and slightly claustrophobic. It was not just fast rapping. It was something more primal. The non-stop delivery mirrored the state of constant vigilance he had lived with since childhood. Transcending the boundaries of fast rapping, his delivery operated on a fiercely primal frequency. His body had been trained to never relax, and now his voice was doing the same thing. The rhymes poured out like a machine gun, leaving no space for silence, no room for the old fears to creep in. People in the Bronx scene started calling him Punisher, and the name stuck. He punished beats. He punished other rappers in battles. He punished himself with food and with the impossible standards he set for his own lyrics. The technical brilliance was undeniable. He could take a simple concept and twist it through so many layers of meaning that the original idea ost disappeared beneath the wordplay. He referenced everything from street life to pop culture to personal pain, often in the same verse. A single line might contain 3 or 4 different meanings depending on how you listen. It was the kind of craftsmanship that demanded repeated listens, and even then, new details kept emerging. As his reputation spread beyond the Bronx, Pun began performing at larger venues. The crowds grew. The energy in the room changed when he stepped on stage. He was still young, still carrying the weight of his past, but on the microphone, he seemed untouchable. The same hyper-awareness that had once helped him survive dangerous streets now helped him read an audience. He could feel when a crowd was with him and when it was slipping away. He adjusted his flow accordingly, tightening or loosening the pressure like a fighter sensing an opponent's weakness. Every performance became another battle, another chance to prove that he was not the scared boy who had once hidden under bridges. Yet the physical changes continued. By the mid-1990s, Pun had crossed 350 pounds. Moving became more difficult. Breathing during long verses required real effort. He started performing seated during longer sets, something that would have been unthinkable for most rappers at the height of their energy. But Pun made it work. The seated position somehow made his delivery even more intense. It was as if all the energy that could no longer go into movement was now being forced through his voice. The rhymes grew denser. The flow became even more unbroken. What had started as a survival mechanism was now becoming a signature style that no one else could replicate. His personal life remained complicated. The distrust that had been drilled into him as a child made relationships difficult. He was fiercely loyal to the few people he allowed close, but he also kept most of the world at arm's length. Food remained his most consistent companion. Late night eating sessions became ritual. He would order massive amounts of food, eat until he felt sick, then sleep heavily, only to wake up and start the cycle again. The weight gain was not just physical. The larger he became, the more invisible he sometimes felt in public, even as his name grew in the hip-hop world. It was a strange contradiction, one he never fully resolved. In 1997, everything changed when he connected with Fat Joe. The two had known each other from the Bronx scene, but now Fat Joe was in a position to bring Pun to a wider audience. They began working together on what would become Terror Squad. For the first time, Pun had real industry support and the resources to record at a professional level. The hunger that had always driven him now had a new target. He poured everything into his verses. The technical complexity reached new heights. Elevating his sights far beyond local MCs, he meticulously prepared to wage war against the entire music industry. The recording sessions for what would become his debut album were intense. Pun approached every track like a military operation. He wrote and rewrote verses until they satisfied his impossible standards. He layered rhyme upon rhyme until the songs felt almost too dense to breathe. Producers and engineers who worked with him described the experience as both exhilarating and exhausting. Pun never seemed satisfied. There was always another layer to add, another pattern to tighten, another way to make the words hit harder. The same drive that had kept him alive on the streets was now pushing him to create something that would stand apart from everything else in hip-hop at the time. By early 1998, the album was finished. Capital Punishment was released in April of that year. It was an immediate success. The lead single, Still Not a Player, became a massive hit, crossing over to mainstream radio and introducing Big Pun to audiences who had never heard anything quite like him. The album debuted at number F, Live on the Billboard 200 and eventually went platinum, making Pun the first Latino rapper to achieve that milestone. Suddenly, the former teenage runaway was staring down from magazine covers and performing on major stages. The world was finally listening to the intricate, relentless rhymes he had been perfecting for years. But fame brought new pressures. The same hypervigilance that had shaped his childhood now had more targets than ever. Interviews, photo shoots, meetings with executives, and the constant attention from fans all triggered the old alarms. Pun handled it with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He smiled for cameras. He gave interviews. He performed with the same ferocious energy. Yet underneath the surface, the old patterns continued. The eating increased. The weight kept climbing. Stripped of its origins as a mere stylistic choice, the non-stop flow on stage morphed into an absolute physical necessity. Stopping to breathe felt dangerous. Slowing down felt like surrender. Fame arrived like a spotlight that refused to turn off. After Capital Punishment went platinum, Christopher Rios could no longer move through the world unnoticed. The same boy who had once hidden under bridges now found himself recognized in airports, restaurants, and hotel lobbies. People wanted pictures, autographs, and pieces of his time. For most artists, this would have felt like validation. For Pun, it felt like exposure. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in the Bronx now had far more targets to track. Every stranger in the crowd could be a threat. Every camera flash could be a weapon. The attention that came with success did not soothe the old alarms. It turned them up. He began installing hidden cameras throughout his home. At first it was just a few, placed in the living room and near the front door. Then more appeared in hallways, bedrooms, and even the kitchen. He told himself it was for security, but the truth ran deeper. Pun needed to watch. He needed to know who came and went, who spoke to whom, and whether anyone was saying things behind his back. The same mind that had once scanned every street corner for danger now scanned every room he lived in. The cameras gave him the illusion of control, but they also fed the paranoia. He spent hours reviewing footage, looking for patterns that might not exist, searching for betrayal in ordinary moments. His marriage to Liza became another battlefield. Pun loved his wife and children deeply, yet the old wounds made trust almost impossible. He grew suspicious of her movements, her phone calls, and her conversations with friends. The cameras captured arguments that escalated quickly. In moments of rage, he sometimes lost control, and later he would watch the footage back with a mixture of horror and detachment. It was as if he was studying a stranger. The man on the screen looked like him, sounded like him, but acted in ways that felt foreign and dangerous. The recordings became another form of self-surveillance. He was watching himself unravel even as he tried to hold everything together. On stage, the contrast was striking. The beats of late 1990s hip-hop were loud, booming, and designed to shake entire venues. Yet Pun's delivery often felt like a whisper laced with threat. He would lean into the microphone and let the words pour out in that relentless, unbroken flow, while the bass thumped behind him like distant artillery. The lyrics themselves were dense with double meanings, warnings, and coded messages. Listeners heard the technical brilliance, but few understood how much of it came from a place of constant fear. Every verse was another layer of armor. Every rhyme scheme was another wall. The louder the beat, the more he seemed to retreat into the quiet menace of his voice. The physical toll was becoming harder to hide. By the end of 1998, he had crossed 400 pounds. Walking short distances left him winded. Long performances required careful pacing. He began carrying oxygen tanks on tour, something he tried to keep private. The non-stop flow that had once been a stylistic choice was now a physical necessity. If he paused too long, his body would remind him how much weight it was carrying. The same mind that had trained itself never to relax was now forcing his lungs and heart to work harder than they were designed to handle. Pun pushed through every show, every interview, every recording session, as if stopping would mean defeat. But the body was keeping score. The success of capital punishment opened doors that had once been closed. Major labels called. Magazine covers featured his face. Younger rappers cited him as an influence. Pun accepted the praise with a mixture of pride and discomfort. He had worked for years to perfect his craft, and now the world was finally acknowledging the complexity of his rhymes. Yet every compliment felt temporary. The old voice in his head, the one that had been formed in those early morning beatings, kept whispering that none of it would last. He responded by working harder, writing more, and eating more. The cycle that had begun in childhood continued, only now it played out under the bright lights of fame. Behind closed doors, the paranoia deepened. Pun began to suspect members of his own team. He questioned their loyalty, their motives, and their conversations when he was not in the room. The hidden cameras extended to the studio and even the tour bus. He listened to hours of audio, searching for evidence of disloyalty that rarely existed. The more successful he became, the more isolated he felt. Success had given him money, recognition, and a platform, but it had not given him peace. The boy who had once believed the world was full of hidden dangers now had proof that thousands of eyes were indeed watching him. The difference was that many of those eyes belonged to fans who loved him, yet his nervous system could not tell the difference between admiration and threat. His lyrics began to reflect this internal war more openly. While the technical skill remained unmatched, the content grew darker and more introspective. He spoke of betrayal, of watching his back, of feeling trapped even as the world celebrated him. Fans heard the words as clever wordplay. Those closest to him heard something closer to confession. Pun was using the same tool he had always relied on. He was turning his fear into art, but the art was no longer enough to contain the fear. It was leaking out in other ways. The weight continued to climb. The arguments at home grew more frequent. The cameras kept recording. By 1999, Pun was performing at major festivals and sharing stages with some of the biggest names in hip-hop. The crowds were larger, the energy higher, and the expectations greater. He delivered every show with the same ferocious precision that had made him famous. Yet off stage, he was struggling. Simple tasks like climbing stairs left him exhausted. His breathing became labored during conversations. Doctors warned him about the strain on his heart and lungs, but Pun had spent his entire life ignoring warnings. The same defiance that had helped him survive the streets now kept him from slowing down. He treated his body the way he had once treated his rhymes. He pushed it to the limit, then pushed it further, convinced that stopping would mean losing everything he had built. The contrast between the public figure and the private man grew sharper with each passing month. On magazine covers, he appeared powerful, confident, and larger than life. In private, he moved carefully, spoke less, and spent long hours reviewing camera footage and eating in silence. He loved his family, yet the paranoia made closeness difficult. He wanted to protect them, but the methods he chose often pushed them further away. Liza tried to help him see what was happening, but Pun could not yet face the full extent of the damage. The mind that had once built fortresses out of rhyme schemes was now building walls around his own pain, and those walls were growing thicker by the day. The body that had once been forced to survive the streets was now turning against him in ways that could no longer be ignored. By the beginning of 1999, Christopher Rios had crossed 450 pounds. Every movement required calculation. Walking from the car to the studio door left him short of breath. Climbing a single flight of stairs felt like running a marathon. Ceasing to function merely as extra mass, the weight actively transformed into a parasitic entity, pressing down on his lungs, squeezing his heart, and turning simple acts of breathing into conscious effort. Pun had spent his entire life pushing through pain. He treated this new reality the same way. He pushed harder. Chronic stress from decades of hypervigilance had taken a measurable toll on his internal systems. The constant state of fight or flight that began in childhood had flooded his body with cortisol and adrenaline for years. Now those same chemicals were breaking down the very systems they were meant to protect. His metabolism had slowed to a crawl. His organs were working overtime just to keep him upright. Doctors who examined him spoke in careful tones about allostatic load, the cumulative wear and tear that comes from living in a permanent state of alarm. Pun listened, nodded, and then returned to the studio. He had no language for what was happening inside him except to keep moving forward. Sleep became another battleground. Severe sleep apnea set in. At night, his airway would collapse under the weight of his own body, cutting off oxygen again and again. He would wake gasping, heart pounding, sometimes dozens of times in a single night. The exhaustion was bone deep. During the day, he fought sudden waves of narcolepsy, moments when his body simply shut down without warning. He would be in the middle of a conversation or a recording session and suddenly feel himself slipping away. These episodes frightened him more than he admitted. The same mind that had once stayed awake for days watching for danger was now betraying him with uncontrollable sleep. The contrast was cruel. In the studio, the physical limitations became impossible to hide. Pun could no longer stand for long periods. Engineers brought in a thick mattress and placed it in the vocal booth. He would lie on his side, one hand holding the microphone, and deliver his verses from that position. Shattering the illusion of creative control, the relentless, non-stop flow defining his style ceased to be entirely a choice. His lungs simply could not support the old intensity for extended periods. He adapted by recording in shorter bursts, pausing between takes to catch his breath, then pushing again. The verses that emerged were still technically brilliant, but they carried a new weight. The words came slower now, not because his mind had slowed, but because his body had begun to set the pace. The frustration was immense. Pun had built his entire identity around control. He controlled his rhymes with mathematical precision. He controlled his image with careful calculation. He had even tried to control his environment with hidden cameras. Now, his own body was refusing to obey. The same man who had once chewed plaster to contain his rage now had to negotiate with his lungs and heart for every verse. He hated the weakness. He hated the way his voice sometimes faltered mid-line, not from lack of skill, but from lack of air. He responded the only way he knew how. He worked longer hours. He pushed through the exhaustion. He ate more, as if food could somehow compensate for the strength his body was losing. The people closest to him watched with growing concern. Liza and his children saw the man they loved struggling to tie his shoes, struggling to get out of bed, struggling to simply exist in a body that had become a prison. Friends and collaborators noticed the changes in his breathing, the way he moved carefully, the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence as if gathering strength. Pun Bruce. He'd off their worry with jokes and bravado. He had survived worse. He had survived beatings at 3 a.m. He had survived the streets. He would survive this too. But the truth was becoming harder to deny. The body that had carried him through childhood trauma and into stardom was now the greatest threat he faced. Recording sessions grew more difficult. What had once taken hours now took days. Pun would arrive at the studio already exhausted from the simple act of getting there. He would lie on the mattress, close his eyes, and focus everything he had left on the words. The verses that came out were still dense with meaning and technical skill, but they carried a new quality. There was a weariness beneath the complexity, a sense that every syllable was being fought for. Engineers who worked with him during this period later described the experience as heartbreaking. They could hear the genius still burning brightly, but they could also hear the body failing underneath it. Pun began to speak less about the future. He focused intensely on the present, on finishing the next verse, completing the next track, delivering the next performance. The paranoia remained, but it was now mixed with a quieter kind of resignation. He still reviewed camera footage. He still questioned motives. But there were moments when the exhaustion overtook even the vigilance. He would fall asleep in the middle of conversations, wake up disoriented, and then push himself to continue as if nothing had happened. The mind that had once been a fortress was now a tired soldier, still standing at its post, refusing to admit that the walls were crumbling. By late 1999, Pun had crossed 500 pounds. Simple tasks required assistance. Getting dressed, getting into a car, climbing onto a stage. Each movement was a negotiation with a body that had turned hostile. Yet he continued to perform, he continued to record, he continued to write. The same defiance that had kept him alive as a homeless teenager now kept him working even as his organs strained under the load. He told himself that if he stopped, everything he had built would collapse. The truth was more complicated. Stopping would mean facing the very demons he had spent his life outrunning. The violence of his past and the constant paralyzing paranoia. The growing sense that no amount of success could silence the alarms that had been ringing inside him since he was a small boy. The medical warnings grew more urgent. Doctors spoke of heart strain, of lungs compressed by layers of fat, of the very real possibility of sudden collapse. Pun listened, agreed to take certain medications, and then returned to the same patterns. He ate to quiet the noise. He worked to prove he was still in control. He moved through each day as if momentum alone could keep the structure standing. The rhymes remained his greatest achievement and his greatest comfort. When everything else felt like it was slipping away, the words still obeyed him. He could still build fortresses out of syllables. He could still create something that no one could take from him. Yet even the words were changing. The flow that had once been an unbroken river now contained small fractures, not because his skill had diminished, but because his body could no longer sustain the old intensity. He adapted by writing verses that allowed for the pauses his lungs required. The complexity remained, but the delivery carried a new texture. It was still unmistakably Big Pun, still technically superior to almost everything else in hip-hop, but it now carried the unmistakable sound of a man fighting his own body for every breath. The final days moved with a strange, heavy stillness. Christopher Rios had spent months negotiating with a body that no longer wanted to cooperate, but even he could feel that the negotiations were coming to an end. The weight had crossed 500 pounds and was still climbing. Breathing required conscious effort. More than a few steps left him dizzy and gasping. He continued to record, continued to write, continued to push, but the pauses between verses grew longer, the exhaustion deeper. Those closest to him noticed the change in his eyes. The defiance was still there, but it was now mixed with something quieter, something closer to surrender. On the morning of February 7th, 2000, Pun woke in his hotel room at the Crowne Plaza in White Plains, New York. He had been in the area for a few days, handling business and preparing for upcoming performances. The night before had been difficult. Sleep apnea had kept him waking every few minutes, each time gasping for air as his airway collapsed under the weight of his own body. He had finally fallen into a heavy, exhausted sleep sometime before dawn. When he woke, the room felt unusually still. He tried to sit up and felt a sharp pressure in his chest, as if something heavy was pressing down from the inside. He lay back down, telling himself it would pass. It did not. The pain spread quickly. It moved from his chest into his left arm and up into his jaw. Pun had experienced discomfort before. He had lived with chronic pain for years, but this was different. This was something final. He reached for the phone beside the bed, his hand moving slowly, as if through water. His fingers found the receiver. He managed to dial before the pain became too much. The call connected to the front desk. He tried to speak, but the words came out as a strained whisper. The person on the other end asked if he was okay. He could not answer. The receiver slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. By the time paramedics arrived, Pun was unconscious. His massive frame lay across the hotel bed, one arm still extended toward the phone. The medical team moved quickly at first, then slowed as they took in the scale of what they were dealing with. Lifting him required more people than usual. The standard stretcher could not support his weight. They had to call for reinforcements and specialized equipment. Even then, moving his body proved extraordinarily difficult. The hotel room door had to be removed from its hinges to get him out. In the hallway, the stretcher buckled under the strain. Staff eventually had to tie his body to a large luggage cart, usually used for moving heavy equipment. It was the only way to get him to the ambulance. The ride to the hospital was silent except for the sound of the sirens and the labored attempts of the paramedics to keep him alive. His heart had already begun to fail. The years of chronic stress, the layers of fat compressing his organs, the decades of untreated trauma that had flooded his system with stress hormones had all taken their final toll. His heart, which had been working 3 times harder than a normal heart for years, simply could not continue. It had enlarged to nearly 3 times its normal size, a physical record of the battle it had been fighting since he was a small boy. By the time they reached the emergency room, there was little the doctors could do. Christopher Lee Rios, known to the world as Big Pun, was pronounced dead at 28 years old. The news spread quickly. Within hours, hip-hop radio stations were playing his music in tribute. Fans gathered outside the hospital and later outside his home in the Bronx. The boy who had once slept under bridges had become a symbol of technical brilliance and Latin pride in hip-hop. Now he was gone. The same body that had once been forced to endure endless punishment had finally surrendered. The heart that had carried so much weight, both literal and emotional, had given out. In the days that followed, the details of his final moments became public. The image of his massive body being tied to a luggage cart to be moved from the hotel room stayed with many people. It was a stark, almost grotesque reminder of how far the physical consequences of his life had gone. Some saw it as a tragic symbol of everything he had carried. Others saw it as the inevitable end of a lifestyle that had spiraled beyond control. Pun himself had never spoken publicly about the full extent of his health struggles. He had kept pushing, kept performing, kept creating, right up until the very end. The world had seen the unstoppable force on stage. Few had seen the man lying on a mattress in the studio, fighting for every breath. His family was devastated. Liza and their children faced the sudden loss of a husband and father who had been larger than life in every sense. The hip-hop community mourned the loss of one of its most technically gifted voices. Younger rappers who had studied his rhyme schemes and tried to replicate his flow now spoke of him as an irreplaceable influence. The platinum album, the hit singles, the battles won, all of it felt suddenly small compared to the finality of his absence. He had been 28 years old. He had achieved more in those 28 years than most artists achieve in a lifetime. Yet the cost had been everything. The autopsy confirmed what doctors had been warning about for months. The cause of death was listed as a massive heart attack brought on by asphyxiation and extreme obesity. His heart had simply stopped under the strain. The years of sleep apnea, the chronic stress, the layers of fat pressing against his lungs and heart had all converged in that hotel room on that February morning. Completely devoid of any dramatic final performance or last verse, the reality concluded abruptly with a man dying alone in a hotel room, reaching for a phone, and then nothing. In the weeks after his death, tributes poured in from across the music world. Fat Joe, who had helped bring him to prominence, spoke of him as a brother and a genius. Other rappers recorded verses in his honor. Fans created murals in the Bronx and held vigils outside the places he had once performed. The technical brilliance of his work was celebrated, but so was the tragedy of his life. People began to speak more openly about the pressures that had shaped him, the childhood trauma, the homelessness, the paranoia, and the way fame had amplified every wound rather than healing it. Big Pun had turned pain into some of the most complex and beautiful rhymes hip-hop had ever heard. In the end, that same pain had taken everything from him. The logistics of his funeral reflected the scale of his life. His body had to be placed in an oversized casket. The procession through the Bronx drew thousands of mourners. People lined the streets to pay their respects to the man who had put Latin hip-hop on the map and who had raised the bar for technical skill in the genre. As the casket passed, many remembered not just the hits, but the story behind them. The boy from the South Bronx who had survived beatings and homelessness. The young man who had turned $500,000 of settlement money into a body that eventually weighed over 500 pounds. The rapper who had built fortresses out of syllables while his own body became a prison. The man who had achieved everything and still could not outrun the damage done to him as a child. In the quiet moments after the public mourning faded, those who had known him best reflected on the contradictions. Pun had been fiercely loyal, deeply talented, and relentlessly driven. He had loved his family and fought for his place in a world that had tried to discard him. Yet he had also carried wounds that never healed and habits that ultimately destroyed him. The same defiance that had kept him alive on the streets had kept him from seeking help when his body began to fail. The same vigilance that had made him a brilliant lyricist had made him paranoid and isolated. The same hunger that had driven him to create extraordinary art had also driven him to eat himself into an early grave. In the months that followed his death, unreleased tracks and freestyles began to surface. Fans listened to every new verse with a mixture of awe and sadness. The technique. Al Brilliance was still there, even in the final recordings. The flow was still relentless, even as his body had been failing. It was as if he had kept creating right up until the moment his heart gave out. That dedication, that refusal to stop, was both inspiring and tragic. Pun had given everything to his art. In the end, His art was all that remained. The world had lost a once-in-a-generation talent. His family had lost a husband and father. The Bronx had lost one of its brightest stars. And somewhere in the silence that followed, the story of Christopher Lee Rios continued to echo. The boy who had turned trauma into language. The man who had built palaces out of rhyme schemes while his own body became a cage. The rapper who had achieved a platinum success and still could not outrun the damage done to a child at 3 a.m. Big Pun was gone, but the weight he had carried, both literal and emotional, would remain a part of hip-hop history for as long as people listened to his music and wondered what might have been if the boy from the South Bronx had been given the chance to heal instead of just survive.